Hi, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. Today is Saturday, November 11th. This is day 36 since the attacks by Hamas on South Israel and since the bombing campaign on Gaza began and the cutting off of water, electricity, and gas shortly thereafter. I wanted to give you some updates. This is just specific to today. We're doing this every day. These updates are on our website. Please take a look at our statements if you'd like to know a more comprehensive picture of how we're responding to the war between Israel and Gaza. Israeli bombardments from air, sea, and land have continued across the Gaza Strip. Palestinian armed groups have continued launching projectiles into Israel. Israeli ground troops have maintained and essentially cut off North Gaza from South Gaza. And so there are slight pauses in certain geographic regions trying to allow the remaining residents in North Gaza to travel south. Over the past several days, tens of thousands of people have done so. There still is a problem that there are people in hospitals and people who are unable to move who are being called to evacuate. And if they do not evacuate, they will be considered combatants. And so that continues to be a major issue. Water, food, and aid is a severe problem, and we are seeing an increase in waterborne illnesses. This is particularly an issue in the north, which is completely cut off. The fatality toll as of today stands at 11,078 Palestinians in Gaza, 4,506 of whom are children. Close to 30,000 people are injured. The Israeli death toll remains around 1,400 people, and it's believed to be that there are 239 people being held captive in Gaza, including Israelis and foreign nationals. Of the hostages being held, it's believed that 30 of them are children. More than 1.5 million people have been displaced. Israeli bombardments have increased significantly around hospitals. And if you've watched the news, you've probably heard this. This is around Gaza City and in the North Gaza Governorate. This intensified significantly November 10th. Many or several of the hospitals have been directly hit. The Israeli ground forces reportedly have completely encircled 4 of the hospitals in the Al Nasser area of Gaza City. One of them is a pediatric hospital, which had to stop its operations on the 9th of November after it was damaged. So 20 out of the 36 hospitals throughout Gaza are no longer functioning. The head of the International Red Cross, who is in the sub-delegation in Gaza, said, "The destruction affecting hospitals in Gaza is becoming unbearable and needs to stop. The lives of thousands of civilians, patients, and medical staff are at risk." Hundreds of thousands of people in North Gaza are running out of food and water. And in that regard, we've been watching closely, if you've been paying attention or watching these videos, the number of trucks that have entered through Rafah, the Egyptian crossing, as of October 21st is only 861, woefully inadequate. It's believed more than 500 trucks a day, at least 5 days a week before the war, were crossing into Gaza. And that was before water, gas, and electricity were cut off. One of the things that's been discussed significantly is what happens in Gaza after all this is over. And you heard Netanyahu say, "We won't stay." Then he said we'd stay. The United States said that the control of Gaza would go to the PA. And so I wanted to take a minute to talk about the possibilities for Israel. And this was an analysis that showed up in Haaretz saying that Israel has 3 choices. One, they could assume responsibility for the administration of Gaza Strip, which would mean the preservation of law and order, management of education and health systems, the rebuilding of infrastructures. This is what Netanyahu, Israel has been clear. They have no intention of rebuilding Gaza. But in terms of the control and political authority, there's been inconsistency in terms of whether or not Israel would reoccupy Gaza. That idea is completely opposed by the US and other Arab states. There are some in the Israeli government and some Israelis who would like for Israeli settlements to return to Gaza the way that they were present there, prior to 2005. Israel's second option would have to do with eradicating Hamas's military wing, but allowing some remnants of the organization to continue to exist as an enfeebled entity that could still govern in some type of civil authority. So prior to October 7th, Hamas distinguished their civil wing from their military wing. But this seems to go against everything we're hearing from the Israeli government, from Netanyahu, about eradicating Hamas in its entirety. The third option is that Israel could terminate Hamas's rule, expel its senior leadership, transfer the administration of routine life to an entirely different entity. This would mean the creation of an international force that would enlaw force and order. This could be, peacekeeping forces from the United Nations. We've been hearing that other Arab states might be involved in this. And this could involve giving the Palestinian Authority responsibility for civilian municipal affairs. And this is what the U.S. has been putting pressure on Israel about, and what Blinken was talking to Abbas about in recent conversations. But we've heard also the PA would not be willing to take control of a devastated enclave with billions and billions of dollars needed to rebuild basic needs. And at this point, we're not even talking about what happens next, because the crisis is so severe in Gaza. I wanted to close just by talking for a minute about why does Churches for Middle East Peace and why do so many humanitarian groups oppose a humanitarian ceasefire? And I knew experts were saying we shouldn't support it. I knew, we as a policy have opposed it, but I wanted to really take a few minutes to give an answer to that question. And this is from Oxfam. They're a humanitarian and development agency that does great work. They work in the occupied Palestinian territories. And they really, I thought, spelled this out beautifully. Number one, international law means we don't need or should not need pauses or quarters in the first place. One of the things we need to fundamentally understand is that life-saving aid to protect civilians is required by humanitarian law. International humanitarian law makes it illegal to target civilians or deny humanitarian relief, including food, medicine, and water. It's illegal to destroy what are called objects indispensable for survival, such as food warehouses, food trucks, water networks. So the creation of safe zones cannot be used to label everything else as a legitimate target. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem are recognized as an occupied territory by many, internationally, even by the U.S. government, the International Court of Justice. So Israel is an occupying power, which has obligations according to international humanitarian law. So unlike Egypt, Israel has the obligation to ensure the welfare of the population in Gaza, and that it is getting the provision of relief supplies, which we know is not happening today. Number two, quarters and pauses are fragile and often ignored. Examples of humanitarian quarters that have been declared include in Ukraine and Syria in the recent years. In Ukraine, civilians were allowed to flee a steelworks in Mariupol, for example. But often quarters are called for, but then not implemented or agreed upon. So Oxfam gives some examples in that regard. There are no specific laws that govern humanitarian quarters or safe zones. They're voluntary agreements. And so often declarations can be made by one side or established with minimal standards, and thus they're extremely fragile. I was reading in reports today about these pauses, which have happened since this weekend, where Israel has controlled this corridor between North Gaza and South Gaza. And then I was reading OSHA interviews with people who've been traveling through the Israeli military, and about how they said they didn't feel safe, and how, one family had to leave some of their suitcases behind, and how when you call it a safe zone or a humanitarian zone, that's actually not what's happening in that space, for example. Number three, humanitarian pauses or safe zones may even put civilians at greater risk. So Oxfam's experience in conflicts around the world is that measures such as that can put civilians at times at greater risks. In war, civilians and soldiers are often unable to access credible information. So rumors and misinformation spreads, and a safe zone could have been declared in a demilitarized area. But if that's not true, people often will walk into a war zone thinking that it's safe. And so governments and armed groups can take advantage of quarters to move personnel or military supplies, which can really fuel the conflict rather than making it more safe for civilians. Number 4, history makes Palestinians in particular fear talk of safe zones and quarters. Because of a long history of displacement from 1948, what Palestinians call the Nakba, further displacement in 1967, Palestinians being forced to flee their homes to other countries or internally within the West Bank or Gaza, have seen and expressed fear about being forced to move again. Palestinians in Gaza fear that talk of moving them into humanitarian quarters or safe zones is really an attempt to remove them permanently to a new location, which has happened throughout history. This is specifically in response at the beginning of the war, Israel and the United States were talking about moving the population in Gaza to the Sinai Peninsula. And many have asked, why won't Egypt allow for refugees to come into Sinai? And it's because the great fear is that would be a forced displacement, where if the Palestinians were removed to Sinai from Gaza, they would not be allowed to return. So I just thought that was a very helpful summary. Finally, this is the last thing from Oxfam. For humanitarians, a ceasefire is the only solution that works. And Oxfam says there are no quarters, pauses, or safe zones in Gaza anyway right now. There's no safe passage for a small number of trucks. We talked about that, trying to cross through Rafah from Egypt. Even if humanitarian quarters are declared, Oxfam is concerned that the continued bombing and rockets will make it virtually impossible to distribute aid through any fragile or narrow quarter. Given the scale of need, we must establish a proper broad aid operation in a safe and peaceful context. Which means Rafah, the border between Egypt not being under bombardment, but a coordinated effort with all people where the bombing would stop and aid could be delivered, particularly to women, children, and vulnerable groups. I'll just remind everyone that the number of UNRWA workers, the UN refugee agency that works with Palestinians, that has been killed is now 101 UN staff people from UNRWA have been killed. That's the highest number of UN aid workers ever since the UN began. And this is why CMEP and our membership coalition of more than 30 denominations is calling for a complete ceasefire, a bilateral ceasefire, to end the violence and deaths of civilians in Israel and in Palestine. Right now, BBC is estimating at times that 6 bombs or missiles are hitting Gaza every minute. And so this is a concern not only for civilians, but for humanitarians and for those who are trying to offer assistance. And so trucks are not getting into Gaza. We have talked about illnesses. Water and food are a desperate, desperate need. And so how can humanitarian agencies be expected to deliver aid as bombs continue to fall? Next Monday, the 20th, we're starting regular Monday calls to Congress. We are asking you, please, 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 if you've not taken our action alert calling for a ceasefire, please do. We are also going to have a vigil on Monday night, the 20th, at the White House calling for a ceasefire. We're trying to do everything we can to call for a return of the hostages, an end to this war, immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance, and that this might be a turning point, that the core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might be addressed.